For today's focus, we go to India, where marriage is an important institution, particularly for women. The notion of the single woman had long been considered an anomaly, but things are beginning to change. The South Asian country currently has more single women than ever before. That's 74 million of them. Those in urban areas, however, are still dealing with discrimination and abuse. Here's a report from our bureau in India.
Tiara Arora moved to Delhi 6 years ago as a young intern. Today, the 24-year-old works in a hip design studio in the Indian capital. She lives on her own, loves her job, and the fact that she's in charge of her own life. She's part of a growing demographic in India, single women.
My mother would never have had this kind of an opportunity for sure. And she had to really struggle and also handle, on the other hand, getting married and having a child. So, I don't have to handle that.
More and more women, especially in urban areas, are choosing careers over getting married. There are currently 74 million single women in India. That's 12% of the female population. There have never been as many single women in the history of the country. And this is a demographic that is growing rapidly. Between 2001 and 2011, their numbers have shot up by 39%. Of course, this group also includes widows, divorcees, and women who've been abandoned by their husbands.
How are you guys? Good. Very good. Do you want a drink?
Yes. Tiara enjoys the freedom that comes with living alone.
Even if you tell your family, you have to come back home and show them that you have done something to prove that I am able to stand up on my own feet.
But it's a very new thing, but at least in my closest circles, everyone is very focused on their careers, and I know everyone will fight for that over getting married.
Even women I've spoken to that may not be from my background, there is this sense that it's kind of creeping in that they also have a say in their family and they also have a say in choosing a career.
Marriage is no longer central to the lives of young women, at least in big cities. In these circles, women are marrying later, and divorce is much less of a taboo than it used to be. With this shift in Indian society, single women are becoming consumers in their own right, and they are pushing brands to change the way they advertise to women.
We personalize technology for you.
Really? While ads showing women doing chores at home still exist, companies are taking note of a new consumer category. Singlehood is a way for women to assert themselves, believes Delhi-based author Rosalind De Mello, who also pens a weekly column on feminist issues.
I think a lot of women don't obviously go around and saying, oh, I'm going to be a single woman. And I think a lot of women often move to other cities as a form of escape, as a way of moving away from the domineering, sort of patriarchal setup of the family, at least within the anonymity of a city. You can live alone and independently, and you don't really have to face the wrath of public judgment. It's a very different question when you go back home to your, the conservative setting that you came from.
Life is much more difficult for the 44 million single women who live in rural areas. They face sexual abuse, face financial hardship, and are frequently denied property rights. Widows, abandoned wives, and unmarried women are socially ostracized, and there is stigma attached to divorce.
This is my husband's motorbike. My brother-in-law destroyed it. He burnt a lot of clothes and also destroyed the beds.
Rajwinder Kaur lives in Punjab. Her brother-in-law wanted to marry her after her husband died in a road accident in order to get his property. When she refused, she incurred his wrath.
This society is not built for single women. It's scary to be alone. People make up all kinds of stories about me and emotionally torture me. It's very difficult to tolerate. I'm determined to stand on my own 2 feet, to take care of my needs, and I never beg for money.
The Ekal Nari Shakti Sangathan helps women like Rajwinder understand their rights, access government entitlements, and battle regressive social customs.
These in rural areas especially, they are not aware of any rights, and they do not voice their pain. We basically empower them to make them realize that this is not the end of their lives.
The women meet once a month to discuss strategies to lobby the government for better welfare policies. They also form an informal support network for each other.
Before, we were on our own. We used to be so scared of what other people might say. But now we are not alone. We have the support of hundreds of other women.
The rural-urban divide couldn't be starker. While some revel in their singlehood, others suffer because of it. But there's room for hope. In 2016, the Indian government for the first time drafted a policy to help single women overcome social and institutional hurdles.
That's now bringing Christophe Guillemot, who's a senior fellow in demography and also an India specialist. Thank you very much for joining us. Right. Now, we're talking about a constitution in India that is supposed to protect women's right to equality. But of course, as we heard in that report, women in the country are far from free. Some of them even feel afraid, as we heard, to be alone, to be single.
Yeah, that is right. The fact is that there is little room for women, for single women in India, be they unmarried or widows. They have no identity, no status, and so they form a really vulnerable group.
Okay, now moving away from that topic of single women, another story that has been making headlines across the globe, certainly over the past year, is the tolerance that exists in the country towards violence. You know, there have been reports of people watching by as women get raped. Are we hearing enough about this from the international community? Is enough being done to eradicate an issue like this?
Well, I think it's first for Indians to do the job. And they have to...
But they haven't so far. So what is the international community doing to make a difference there?
Well, we are publicizing what's happening in India. But first, it's because of Indian NGOs or Indian researchers or press people that we know what's going on. And so it's very important for the government and other civil society organizations to mobilize around these issues. And actually, a lot of these organizations are doing it, but there is a long way towards gender equity in India.
Now, you mentioned NGOs, you mentioned people that work in the media. Now, another measure that was introduced, and I heard reports of this in 2017, it was reported that more than 12,000 public schools in India, in their classrooms, they're introducing discussions so that children from a very early age can debate the topic of gender equality. Do you think something like that, if it starts early on in life, can have an impact?
Absolutely. And I've seen schools in villages in India where now girls and boys interact together, and girls can be actually the best students. And so the boys may emulate girls. I think it's a very good step, and I think once we can expect women to catch up with boys, with men in terms of education. And that's a goal that's likely to be reached within a decade or so.
So you're hopeful about the future of women in India from the time that you've spent there and from the research that you've conducted?
Absolutely. I mean, things were much worse in the past. And of course, what we see in terms of rape or in terms of harassment is bad enough. But I think people mobilize around this issue, and that is for me, it's a sign of hope.
And I would like to end on a slightly more optimistic note, if we can, because we can't ignore the progress that has been made up until this stage. Child marriage is now illegal in India. Property rights have been given to women. Can you give us other examples of the way that women have been making progress for their rights in the country?
Well, I think here you were insisting on laws, and on paper they're great.
The laws that impact women.
Yes. But the fact that a lot of these laws are not yet fully implemented. For example, you mentioned property rights. Very few women have actually property over land. And a lot of them are denied inheritance rights. So, yes, on paper, things are great, but the way they are implemented or enforced on the ground is a very different story. And that's where women, as the women we've seen in the report, are showing the directions.
Very briefly, do you yourself, are you in the position to make recommendations to lawmakers in India to make a difference?
Well, I think they have to go back to the ground to discuss with women, for instance, to hear the story of discrimination, of harassment, and then they will understand how terrible public life can be for women. And that's, you just have to listen to stories. And then you will come up with a local adjustment and maybe national laws. But let's start with society, stories that you hear from families, not only from the street. That's where change is going to take place.
Christophe Guilmontois, an India specialist, thank you very much for speaking to us on this important topic of women's rights in India here on France 24. And that's it for us.